Hello and welcome to a conversation on the Daily Burn. I'm your host, Eric Miller, joined today by an awesome progressive from Washington, D.C., a fierce and fiery fighter, as I like to say, Janeese Lewis George. How you doing, Janeese?
I'm doing well. I'm happy to be here with you, Eric.
Thanks for taking some time to chat with me. I'm tempted to call you JLG for some reason.
People have been doing that. Yes, you can do it.
Cool. Yeah, so it's a real treat to chat with you. You won a heavily contested primary in your fourth ward race against kind of a party insider. I guess 2 or 3 months ago now, but you still have to get elected in November. I think the process is November 3rd. Make sure you vote for Janeese. And you are unbought and unbossed, as I think that was Shirley Chisholm's line, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
Right on. Yeah, I want to ask you a little bit about what you hope to accomplish, your platform, some policies. I'll pull up a map of your ward and you can brag on a little bit. But I always like to start back, like, what was the thing that animated you politically? This isn't the first elected office you've had, but so what animated you politically to run for electoral politics in the first place?
Yeah, I think it was the combination of, I grew up in Ward 4 where I ran for office, and it was just a combination of continuing to see our city grow more prosperous and that prosperity not reach everyone. And by everyone, I mean individuals who have been a part of the city, Black and Brown communities here in the district. And we were being pushed out. And we had dealt with one of the highest rates of gentrification in this country. One of the fastest rate of gentrification happened in this country. And so you had 22,000 residents displaced, the large percentage of those residents, Black and Brown DC residents. And for so long, some of us, who came back home after college and came back to a different city, what we realized, a lot of us carried guilt and shame about our experience. Our family, got pushed out of our homes, whether it was to the cost of rent or the cost of housing. And I was in a place of shame about, the displacement and how we impacted. And then, 2016 really came around and I started to, see, leaders like Bernie Sanders and leaders growing and saying, listen, wait a minute, there's nothing to be ashamed about right here. Like, this is a system, policies and people created a system in which residents like, myself and my family were displaced out of this city. And so instead of being ashamed, let's replace the people who make the policies, so that we can actually see a difference, and let's step out of a space of shame and step into a place of being willing to fight for working people and working families to have a space in our community.
Right on. Actually, let's go into housing then. That's one of the key issues, right? So, you mentioned gentrification. You are advocating and fighting for affordable housing. I guess housing as a right, to go that far, right?
Yeah.
Can you talk about your platform in that and what that would look like in the fourth ward?
Right. And so, I think housing is healthcare. And I also think housing is a human right. And so as we are in this space, for me, what housing, we should absolutely have a homes guarantee here in our community and in our ward. What it looks like for us as a city, we have public housing here in our community that has been dilapidated for years. We have been backed in housing repairs forever. And so what it looks like for me is the city needs to make the investment to repair our public housing. And so I'm asking for, a $35 million investment to repair public housing here in our community. What housing looks like for me also talks about, breaking barriers to ownership. Many of our communities here in DC, Black and Brown families were renting for so long, and people, some of it was renting because of not having the financial means and not having financial literacy, but a lot of it was due to the discrimination of, being able to get loans and lending opportunities, and coming against that. One of the big things that's happening right now in our city is we're trying to reclaim rent control. You can go to reclaimrentcontrol.org to look at what we're talking about. But one of the biggest things is we haven't updated updated our rent control laws since 1976, right? So we have buildings built before 1976 that fall within rent control. And right now we're asking the council within the next couple of weeks, actually, to not only extend our rent control laws, but expand them to buildings built before 2005, which would substantially increase the amount of housing that can fall under rent control. And it's important for our Ward 4 community because we have one of the largest senior populations that are on fixed incomes and can't deal with the rising hikes of rent. But we also have so many of our working class individuals in our community that can't deal with the rising hike of rent here in our community. And so we want to see rent control expanded. We also want to, I'm asking the city for a $5 million investment in our emergency rental assistance program. As we enter COVID-19, we deal with COVID-19, we are going to have to invest in our community and making sure tenants are able to stay here, that residents are able to stay here. So we need to cancel rent completely so that we don't end up expanding another issue, which is our emerging and high homeless population here in our community. And so in those ways, we want to see true affordable housing. And when we talk about true affordable housing here, the average median income in the District of Columbia is combined with Maryland and Virginia. So you're looking at, $124,000 average median income. And so when you talk about what that AMI looks like, we need to make sure we're at 30% AMI. Families who make less than $50,000, $30,000, $80,000 a year, can afford to stay here in that community. And we need to do that, I think, with a combination of social housing and a combination of inclusionary zoning, where we actually bring oversight and enforcement to that inclusionary zoning.
Amazing. Boy, there's a couple things I want to follow up in there. First off, kudos to you for fighting even before November 3rd. You're making these asks, as a primary winner and as a citizen at this point. So that's, that speaks volumes to your passion, right? When you said about the AMI and the other areas not in your ward, does that then skew it? Is that?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
When you
talk that's intentional, I would think.
Oh, it absolutely does. You're talking about including the suburbs of Maryland, Virginia. I mean, right. It absolutely does.
Yeah. And two other things. I imagine there's a real estate lobby. You talk about gentrification, and this is going to be you're going to be the David and they're going to be the Goliath. What's your strategy on confronting the real estate lobby? And I'm assuming they sponsor other members of the council.
Yeah. So, one of the biggest benefits I have is coming out of the Attorney General's office. I work for Attorney General Paul Racine, who has been unafraid to come against, the housing, the slumlords, as we would refer to them, as our community. And so, yes, that exists. But, the other part of that is, one of the reasons I ran as a unbought boss candidate, and unbought meaning I was a fair elections candidate, which is the first time we're actually running. We've done fair elections here in the district. So we didn't take any developer corporate, money at all. And all of our funding came from individuals of our community. And we, had the largest amount of funders coming out of our Ward 4 as well. So what we have on our side are, what I say is, we have the people on our side. We have individuals who are going to come out and testify at the next hearing regarding some of the things we want to see, including rent control, and that are coming up this fall right now. And so, yes, I'm coming against a lobby, but I'm fighting this lobby with the people. And we were able to do that. I mean, they donated a substantial amount of money to the incumbent. And so that proved that you can get money from whoever you want to, but if you don't have the people's vote, that doesn't matter.
Yeah. And while we're on the topic, I'll just throw it out. So if you're watching this, it's JaneeseForDC.com, and she could certainly use a war chest, right? So even though you're through the primary, it's not, she still needs our help, right?
Yeah. And the maximum anyone can give is $50 because I'm a fair elections candidate. Yeah.
Okay. Awesome. So let's talk a little bit about what issues are your constituents are facing. Let's start with like wages and sort of the erosion of the middle class. What's your take on that, or hope to fight? Any legislation and ideas on how to sort of tackle that issue for your constituents?
Yeah, so one of the wage issue is one of the issues that got me to run for office. We had fought here in our community for Initiative 77, which was a fight for a one fair wage for tip workers. And I actually worked as a tip worker throughout my time in law school to be able to help my family, be able to stay here and avoid displacement. And so I knew from personal experience that $3.89 wasn't enough for families to be able to survive and to support families. And I also knew and worked with individuals who were providing for their family on tips, and it really wasn't enough. And so one of the votes that happened in 2018 was we voted for a ballot initiative for Initiative 77 for one fair wage, and actually the ward voted for it, and the city voted for it as a ballot initiative. And literally, as soon as we voted for it, the next council session, the restaurant lobbied our council members and got them to repeal the initiative, the ballot initiative that the voters had just voted for. I mean, and we already deal with disenfranchisement as a city because we don't have a vote in Congress, we don't have statehood. So to really disenfranchise us further by us voting for something and then you immediately repealing, absolutely pissed me off, to the point that it was like one of the last straws to me running. So obviously I'm a supporter of one fair wage, which is, we have a movement happening across this country about a fair wage for tip workers. But also I think at this point we need to talk about, UBI and a universal basic income for communities. And we see it happening across, in different areas across the world where they are, looking at UBI. And I think we do deserve to have a universal basic income. If nothing else, we've seen during COVID that families, people are struggling, even with the unemployment rate. And so, I think there is a way to, we're going to fight for one fair wage here in the district. We're going to try to bring that back to the council and hopefully be able to get a vote and it be respected by the leaders. We're also going to try to see ways in which we can create some type of universal basic income. But we also are looking at, one of the things we're looking at also is our domestic workers and our childcare workers is another area that gets ignored in our city. And, they have asked, for us to advocate, and I'm going to advocate for some of our domestic workers and our excluded workers as well, to be able to be included, not only just in COVID relief, but really giving them some, a basic income that must be met in order for them to be able to work in our community. And those are the areas where we have to address. And there has been a war on I think unions in this country. And I come from a union family. My mom's a member of the American Postal Worker Union. She's been an APW member for 33 years. And even right now, she's still working as a postal worker and fighting the union against the president at this very moment. But unions have a specific place as it relates to especially the Black community, because I have talk about how, the war on unions is also a war on the Black middle class and our ability to be able to have economic growth and development. And so when we talk about that also, I'm fighting to make sure that we have union jobs here in our city. We have development that happens in the city. We have the Southwest waterfront fully developed, produce no union jobs. There should be no mass development happening in this city without union jobs being produced from it, and without union contracts being a part of it. So, that's the other thing we're bringing to the council, is making sure that unions not only are at the table, but that union jobs and contracts are going to be created as a result of any development we see happening in our community.
Awesome. Yeah, you mentioned childcare in there from the worker perspective, but also you're pushing for universal childcare for the. Can you talk about that?
Oh, I think this is the area that really needs the most, attention, and it's a huge issue in our community specifically. In DC, we have one of the highest, rates for childcare in the country, for how much families have to pay per year for childcare costs. But we also know, through, health, scientific evidence, research, that birth to 3 are critical years in a child's development. And we look at how that impacts Black and Brown communities. It's very real, the impact that not having services from birth to 3 has on a child's trajectory. And so we have the Birth to 3 for All Act here in the district that we are keenly working to fully fund and to make sure that happens. But I think where we need to have universal childcare is, I think that universal childcare needs to be a part of our school system. In the sense that, we have schools that include childcare through 3rd grade, and then let's do 3rd grade through 6th grade, and so on and so forth. But, parents and families can start having their children in childcare. I know, Sweden, other countries do it from like after the 6-month point or after the 9-month point. But I think this is one of the areas where, it really halts. And I will say this, it's a women's rights issue as it is a labor issue and a wage issue as well. But I think we can absolutely get this done. And, the district was one of the first to do, kindergarten, universal pre-K. And we saw the impacts that it had. I benefited from that, families coming in early and having that happen. And so Birth to 3 for All and universal childcare is absolutely something we have to focus on. And I think that we can have happen here in the district. And it'll also help deal with the labor rights issues that come with that. Many of our childcare workers, childcare center workers, are underpaid and mistreated and don't get the services they need. And so bringing that universal childcare into our, under the government's purview would also help improve the conditions of our childcare workers.
Yeah, amazing. I want to ask you a bit of a horse race kind of question. I love talking policy, but there's a couple things you mentioned here, right? The restaurant lobby, squashing that is disenfranchising, dispiriting, right? The real estate lobby we talked about. You mentioned the waterfront, not giving union jobs. Yep. You were challenging an incumbent, and it was a tough hill to climb, and you won, right? How did you flip those disenfranchised voters into coming out in greater numbers than the incumbent had? Like what was your key to success in activating people, getting them, to leave their house, go out and pull the lever for you? What do you think?
I think, I feel like there's a combination of so much. I will say one was, I spoke to my story, and it was a story that resonated with so many. And that's why, me being a fair elections candidate was so important, because fair elections gives the opportunity for individuals like myself who don't have a wealthy background to be able to run for office, right? And so what people, I think, saw when hearing my stories, like, she's one of us. I talked about, I didn't just say, oh, we need affordable housing. I said, you know what, when I came back from college, my family, my mom said the rent had gone up twice. It was going up a 3rd time. And we had to leave the house that I grew up in. And I had to work 2 jobs as a result of that, right? When I talked about, paid family leave, it wasn't just, a progressive talking point. It was, I had to take unpaid leave to care for my father before he unfortunately passed away. And so paid family leave was a personal fight. And it's a choice that so many of us has to deal with, taking care of our spouses, taking care of our children, taking care of our parents, and deserving to have a living wage while doing so. It was when I talked about, the egregiousness of of them repealing Initiative 77, it was like, I worked as a tip worker. So and I had someone tell me when they were, arguing with me, well, how many tip workers did you talk to? And I was like, I talked to myself. Okay. Right. And, it's so much different, because when you are coming from having experienced that, and we talked about TOPA rights, which is our Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act rights. And, we were able to use our TOPA rights to, save ourselves from being displaced and have our home. And then for the council to get rid of it, it was like, listen, this was the thing that saved my family from displacement. And since they've taken it away, 6,200 families have been displaced. It's one thing to have to to talk about policy issues. It's another thing to talk about how the decisions our leaders have made have impacted you personally, and to be able to give that story. And so many people were like, that's my story. And it hasn't been people haven't heard it, and people haven't seen it. And it's another thing for leaders to have to look you in the face. Some of the very leaders who, argue these things, I said, you know what, everything you did impacted my life. And it's another thing for them to have to look at that and say, oh, this is the result. I wonder if some of the leaders who, made some of the decisions they did about gentrification realize, hey, there's going to be some children who grow up in this era who are the result. We push out and try to displace and do all these things to their communities and families, who are going to come back and say, wait a minute, this was wrong, and I'm here to right that wrong. And so I think it was the nature of just the authenticity of my story being relatable to so many. And I think it also was the moment in time we were in. I've said before, I think reality endorsed me. And it's because, when COVID struck, I had been talking about inadequacies in healthcare. When I first started, I had been talking about Initiative 77, and the first people to lose their jobs that Thursday when COVID hit were tip workers at restaurants. I had been talking about, paid family leave and why it was so important. And now you saw parents having to teach their students, go on live and try to work and, deal with parents and sickness and needing it. So, and then when I talked about public safety and investing in communities instead of, throwing money at the police department, George Floyd happened, Ahmaud Arbery happened, Breonna Taylor happened. So I think it was a combination of my story and the moment we were in as a community. And then also I had the support of some groups that have historically not come together. Black Lives Matter DC endorsed me. I was the first candidate they had ever, endorsed in a race. And then we had Black Lives Matter, we had Jews United for Justice campaign fund, we had Working Families Party and unions who usually go with incumbents. I got to tell them my stories and they were like, oh, this is the story of our members. And so I think it was a combination of just that authenticity, the moment we were in, and the coalition we were able to build of progressive groups and grassroots groups and social advocates.
Love it. Yeah, that's boy, I was telling your colleague from your campaign, Matt, before we went on, there's such a distinct difference when there's an authentic advocate for the people versus, a corporate puppet, if you will. So yeah, I think that resonates. Not to leave off the DC animal voters or animal voters of DC. I saw you guys.
Yeah, oh yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, we
really great.
We end up with 33 endorsements total. So I always get in trouble when I go through the endorsement works because I'm
right. No way to list them all. Right.
I'm like, I don't want to forget everyone, but there were a lot of groups who endorsed me who were endorsing for the very first time, like Sanctuary DMZ, for example, works on immigrant issues and immigrant rights issues. And what we're dealing with now with what we're seeing, the genocide we're seeing in this country and ICE centers, we had to deal with in Ward 4, they were trying to bring an ICE detention center to our community. And we were like, hell no, this isn't happening. One, this is a sanctuary city. And outside of a sanctuary city, this is a sanctuary community. And we will not have that happening here. And so just so many organizations who understood what was at stake and saw what was happening nationally and in our local community came out and supported, and their members just, went, we had, Sunrise Movement, the Young People, Climate Change, Sierra Club, DSA. It was 33 orgs, so I don't want to get in trouble, but everyone
I got you.
Out and gave their all.
Yeah. I really appreciated the animal one because, there's a video on YouTube. I recommend anyone go check it out. And you make the point about, tenancy rights, about having a companion animal. And we don't really think of that as a frontline issue, but it absolutely is. And, you were prepared to fight that fight. So I thought that was a unique thing. So I wanted to highlight that.
Thank you.
You mentioned George Floyd and ICE. Let me ask you two questions. I don't know if you've had a chance to read up on the ICE story that broke yesterday about Georgia and sort of these forced hysterectomies and some of the detainees. It's just, it's medieval, and it's just, pardon my language, it's just a fucking nightmare, right?
Absolutely. I'm glad you say it. I can't say it, but yes, what you said.
Right. Can you I mean, I don't know how versed you are. It just broke yesterday, right? So I don't know if you've read it or whatever, but do you have any initial thoughts about ICE, about this story? You mentioned a detention center, being proposed into your ward.
Mhm.
Can you speak on that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we're seeing here happening in our country and across the world is, it's genocide, right? I mean, we are a tax funded genocide, so we as taxpayers are funding this genocide happening on our land. And um, you know, when AOC, called them, camps, everyone went up in arms about it. But the reality is that's what they are, and that's what we're condoning, and turning a blind eye to. And we don't want to get to a place. This is how it starts out. This is how we know things have started out historically. Where we see mass genocides, and we're seeing it happening on our ground in our community. And I can't think of them. I don't know what else it will take for people to recognize that we are at war for our democracy, and people are dying as a result of it. And the African American community specifically also has a history dealing with genocides, that many people don't know. But a lot of women, especially I think it was in Mississippi, went through that same hysterectomy, and there's a underlying history within our community regarding it. So it absolutely is the worst of of mankind, of who we are. And we are absolutely at war. And there's this phrase that says, silence at this point means you're okay with what's happening, and you can't be
Right.
silent at this time. And so I think we need to end the mass genocide. We need ICE. We need to abolish ICE, and we need ICE out of our communities. And we're fighting here in the district for that. We have a Sanctuary Values Act that was an emergency act passed, that we need to make sure permanently gets passed in the fall. In many of our groups, we have an ICE out of DC coalition. We have Sanctuary DMV, which I spoke about earlier, who are at the front lines of this fight, right now here in our community.
Yeah. You mentioned sort of the genocide historically. That brings to mind, obviously, the George Floyd thing. You mentioned the Black Lives Matter endorsement. I know you've been active in that, defund the police and so forth.
Mhm.
Can you talk about, I guess, a couple things around that? One is the defund the police. How likely is that, and how can you take that fight to the fourth ward? I imagine there's a lot of police unions there, right? And then maybe take that to the school to prison pipeline, which happens everywhere, but particularly in congested areas, heavily populated areas like yours. Can you talk about those things?
Yeah, I mean, the moment we are, we're at in our country, where I literally was dealing with anxiety, every week, because of the idea that, oh God, is another Black person gonna get killed by the police department this week? And we had our own, shooting recently. A young man named Deon K, was murdered recently. And every week that we and I was wondering, I don't know how many people wake up, in other communities, and like, oh God, I have an anxiety now of the news coming on, turning on the news and seeing another Black person murdered, and then nothing happening. It's very devaluing of you as a person to see Breonna Taylor today. They offer a $12 million lawsuit instead of justice.
Right.
How does that make you feel? As she's a frontline worker, she's a Black woman. How does that feel? And today I felt angry about a $12 million settlement versus justice for Breonna Taylor. And I don't understand how people don't understand that this moment requires more than just reforms. Because I want to be clear, in many of the places where we saw George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, these areas, they had reforms in place. I don't know how much we need to explain to people the historical nature of the police department, and how it was born out of maintaining racism and slavery in our society and Jim Crow laws. And I also, if you don't understand from a historical perspective, at least understand, I would say from a practical perspective, that your tax dollars are being spent, massive amounts of your tax dollars are being spent on police departments to keep us safe and to deter crime. And that's not happening. And it's historically and consistently not happened. And also the amount that we criminalize what I would call crimes of poverty, from drug use to crimes dealing with, sex workers and prostitution, from crimes, that are born out of poverty and institutional cycles of poverty, and addressing them, every problem we have with policing. That is what creates the school to prison pipeline. In fact, when I graduated from college, I actually worked as a City Year Corps member in Los Angeles. And the idea of City Year was that we could identify when students would drop out based on their attendance score, their behavior score, their math and reading score. And if a student was low in any of those areas, 3 of those areas, they were likely to drop out and go to prison. And they were using these same statistics to build prisons. I just want to be clear. And so we went in to use those statistics to get people back on track. But whenever we have societal problems, no one has had a problem with the amount education has been defunded in this country, right? You defund education, no one's up in arms. You see people defunding public housing or not, funding, housing, and it's not a problem. But you ask them to take the funding away from police departments that have exorbitant amounts of funding. Here in DC, we spend $500 million on the police department, yet we're fighting to get repairs done for public housing. We're fighting to make sure our public schools are adequately funded and teachers are respected. We're fighting for behavioral social services in our community, and not understanding that poverty and the trauma that's created from poverty directly impacts public safety. And so it's really a waste of money to continue to throw money at policing, but not throw money at solving the societal problems that create the issues of violence in our communities. And I'm at a point where I'm like, I don't know how to say this any more plain for people to get it, right? Like, I don't know how many more Black people need to be killed by the police for people to get it. And I don't know how much people need to continue throwing money at police departments and realizing that doesn't fix the problem, instead of investing that money in our communities. Is it going to be difficult to get people to shift? Absolutely. But have we built coalitions and individuals who are willing to fight to make that happen? Yes. And we've seen people doing the work now to get that to happen. I'm hoping some of these conversations, is helping move the needle. But at the end of the day, we're going to need leaders who are going to be bold enough to come against the police union and qualified immunity and say, enough is enough. I'm hoping that happens, very soon. We're seeing it happen in some communities, but not in enough.
Yeah. And it takes unbossed and unbought people in office to fight that fight, right? If you're not taking, police union money, then, you're not beholden to that, right?
Right.
Boy, one thing you said in there that's kind of I'm going to make an analogy, and it's a dark and sad one. You talked about that study, about the students, right? It's akin to when you go to Target or a store and they ask you for your zip code, and they use that as market research to where to build the next store, right? So private prisons, of course, engage in that same sort of level of market research, and boy, that's just gross. I didn't use the F word that time, so
but it makes it feel like this is all purposeful, right? I mean, when we talk about how capitalism impacts our entire community, it's like there's no way that Black people in this country, in our community, have not grown economically. The wealth disparity is still the same. Education disparities are still the same, even in our community. When we look at student improvement here in DC, we have students, white students have made improvements, Black students have remained at the same level, right? Even with literacy, with math, with all of these things. We see it just in so many of our things. We have one of the highest rates for mortality for Black mothers and infants here in our community. And, it's just the facts are there. How does upward mobility not happen? It feels, and it should feel to most people, that this is purposeful. And unless we're going to make some real big structural changes, as they will call it, we're not going to see improvements happen.
Yeah, absolutely. It's purposeful. You mentioned the maternity rate. We're talking a lot of local issues, but one of the sort of national ones is Medicare for all. That if we had a sort of base level Medicare for all, that would go a long way in that maternity rate fatality. Can you talk about your position on like Medicare for all, guaranteed healthcare, single payer, that type of thing?
I mean, yes, absolutely. The idea that, the one thing I will say is, when everybody came for Medicare for all, when Bernie had been talking about Medicare for all from 2016 to this year, everyone said, oh, it's illogical, it's impossible, it'll cost us all of this money and we don't have it, it'll cost us this amount. And then all of a sudden, when COVID happened, it had enough money to bail out Wall Street and the banks, like more money than what we would have needed to have Medicare for all, right? That was the moment where I was hoping everyone it looked around and said, oh, that was all BS. This was absolutely possible.
Right.
And I still believe that, I won't get to it because we're supposed to be voting blue in November, but I was going to say, one of the things I say is that, I think if Super Tuesday, COVID would have happened before Super Tuesday, America would have exposed its hand at how possible Medicare for all was and how much they were just making that up because they then bailed out the community. But what I will say is that's the other piece that feels purposeful. The rate of mortality for Black, mothers, but also for Black fathers. I lost my father to heart disease in 2016, and I talk a little bit about it with paid family leave, but a lot of my friends and I were talking, a lot of us have lost our fathers very early on in our lives. And we start talking about, what is it about Black men's health, that we're losing our fathers this early, and why isn't it happening for other communities? And we get back to just the point that Medicare for all and us not moving towards Medicare for all as a community, is racist, period. I mean, I'm not even going to say has racist undertones. That's like playing it down. The idea that individuals can't get insulin, but why do people have to pay the amount of money they pay for insulin when in reality, the amount to produce insulin, it should be free, right? The idea that we don't have adequate health care and Medicare for all would solve so many of our issues. Once again, gets me back to the point that, is this purposeful, right? Is this purposeful that you don't want to provide Medicare for a nation where we desperately need it? We've had families during COVID-19 who have been afraid to go to the hospital because of the bills that they're going to incur by going to the hospital, right? This is the system you've created. People would rather die and are left to die because they can't afford having adequate healthcare access. This is just, and I don't even want to do the comparisons. Every other developed country has this, Medicare for all. So the idea that we can't do something is also BS. We knew it was BS, and I don't know how many examples we need, whether it's the other countries we need or whether it's the bailout for banks and billionaires that show it. But it is one of the biggest, grievances of our community that we don't have Medicare for all in this country. And I think we have to keep fighting for it. Incremental change, the idea with this whole Medicare for all and everybody flip-flopping on the issue when Bernie was like, no, this is what we need Medicare for all, goes back to the notion of people who are willing to accept incremental change at this moment, when this moment doesn't call for incremental change. It calls for absolute, absolute change happening now, and we can't afford it, and our lives depend on it, and it's a travesty that the country hasn't moved towards it.
Here. I can't wait to have you back in January after hopefully Joe Biden gets inaugurated, and then we can have that fight. We didn't even get to climate change, Medicare for all.
We didn't get to climate change.
Okay, we'll fight that fight in January. I don't think I pulled up your district. I want to pull this up and just give you an opportunity to brag on it a little bit, and we'll kind of close with this. So Ward 4 is kind of like the northeast of, I guess there's 8 wards in Washington D.C.
Yeah.
And this is like the sort of northeast corner.
We're the top of the diamond.
Right on.
Yeah.
I'm just going to hand it over to you. Brag on your district.
Oh man, so Ward 4 is one thing. What we love about Ward 4, one is the diversity of Ward 4, and when I talk about diversity, I'm talking about in every sense. Socioeconomic status, background, ideology. Ward 4 really is representative, I think, of the entire city. All in one ward. We have one of the largest Latino populations. We have one of the largest African immigrant populations that adds to our amazing and beautiful diversity. Ward 4, each of our communities are unique in their own way, which is wonderful, from like Petworth to Tacoma to Chevy Chase to Riggs Park. Ward 4 really has its own flavor. And we have a lot of activists. I want to say that my ward is like home to activists, and nonprofit leaders and labor unions. I like to brag about that because, there's no way you can win a ward without having the backing of so many people, working families and working people. And part of that is most of those people, live in my ward. You have, labor workers and union workers and nonprofit, all in it. The other thing is we have some of the most amazing schools. Our principals, our teachers, our public schools are just, spot on, and they care about students. And, it's wonderful to see that. The other thing we have in DC is hyperlocal leadership, which is our ANC commissioners. Who are also our advisory neighborhood commissioners, and each of them get, a single member district. But, I like to brag that we have some of the most brilliant ANC commissioners in the city. And that adds to how great we are as a ward, because there's committed individuals working at every level, from education to our commissioners to our advisory neighborhood. So we have civic associations. So all of our communities have associations. And it's just some of the most amazing and brilliant individuals. And I love the diversity of our ward. It's just old and new residents, everyone from various backgrounds. But what I love is how much people in our ward are committed to justice and equity, no matter their background or socioeconomic background. We have a ward committed to justice and equity. And we want to, there's a saying in our city, where Ward 4 goes, the city goes. And that's because most of our mayors have come out of Ward 4. And that's not my desire to become the mayor. But the point is, where Ward 4 goes, the city goes, is the saying. And so if Ward 4 goes towards equity and goes towards justice and equality, then the city should follow. And so I'm looking forward to leading Ward 4, showing what equity and diversity and justice looks like, from housing to education to environmental and transit issues, and then letting other wards see that it's possible, and then taking that throughout the city. And so the way Ward 4 is going to go is the way the city should go, and that's towards justice, equity, and equality for all of our residents.
Right on. You're gonna make me cry. That's amazing. So let me just plug the website again. It's janeesefordc.com. Like I said, she still needs your vote on November 3rd. She could certainly use a donation, build a war chest, And boy, I can't wait to have you back on and call you councilwoman. So I look forward to that. Yeah, thanks for taking some time to chat with me about all this. I could talk to you all day. We didn't even get to half the stuff. So yeah, hopefully.
I know. I got to come back, because we got to tackle this environmental justice issue and climate change.
Love it. Yeah, thank you. Thanks for taking the time, and thanks, Matt, for coordinating this. And hope best of luck on November 3rd at your inauguration. And I'll talk to you on the other side.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Bye.